You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. I'm sitting here from the county jail. Just kidding. But I almost ended up there for real. The moment I saw Sarah sprawled on our front steps, clutching her shoulder in agony, something cold and calculating clicked inside me, a familiar sensation I hadn't felt since my final deployment. 25 years as a Navy SEAL teaches you to channel rage into strategic patience. The HOA enforcer who had shoved my wife stood there with two of his cronies, smirking as if he'd just completed a successful mission. He had no idea who he was dealing with. No idea what kind of precision-engineered response he had just triggered. I wasn't going to put him in the hospital. I was going to dismantle his entire operation, methodically and legally, the way I'd been trained to neutralize threats without leaving evidence. Where are you watching this from? Drop a comment below if you've ever dealt with power-tripping, HOA tyrants, or petty dictators who desperately needed to be put in their place. Trust me, what happened next will make your day. After 25 years of service in the Navy SEALs, all I wanted was peace. That's what Sarah deserved after standing by me through countless deployments, through the nightmares, through the recovery from PTSD that still occasionally gripped me in the early hours of the morning. She'd been my rock when I was thousands of miles away in hostile territory, and again when I returned home with pieces of myself missing. Not physical pieces, but the kind of soul fragments that combat tears away. When retirement finally came, we chose Pine Creek Estates, specifically because the listing agent described it as quiet and tight-knit. Sarah fell in love with the spacious backyard where she could plant her medicinal herbs for the tea she made for her hospital patients. I appreciated the garage, large enough for my woodworking tools, and the proximity to a small lake where I could fish in solitude. We thought we'd found our forever haven. The first 6 months were everything we'd dreamed about during those long deployments. I started teaching free self-defense classes to neighborhood kids. Sarah continued her work as head nurse in the emergency department at the local hospital. We hosted small barbecues, made friends with Mike and Rebecca Johnson next door, and slowly, I felt the hypervigilance that had been my constant companion for decades begin to ease. I built Sarah a trellis for flowering vines as an anniversary gift. 25 years of marriage deserved something handmade with care. I spent weeks designing it, making sure it was sturdy but elegant, something that would showcase the climbing roses she'd always wanted to plant. The smile on her face when I unveiled it was worth every splinter and every bead of sweat. 3 days later, the first knock came. A muscular man in his mid-30s with a tight polo shirt stretched across his chest stood at our door with a clipboard and a scowl. He introduced himself as Chad Wilson, compliance officer for the Pine Creek Homeowners Association. Mr. Morrison, your recently installed garden structure violates HOA Regulation 27B, Section 4. All external modifications require pre-approval by the Architectural Review Committee. This is a $500 0 violation and the structure must be removed within 48 hours. I remember blinking slowly, processing his words with the same deliberate calm I'd use when receiving unexpected intelligence in the field. I explained that we hadn't been aware of the need for pre-approval but would be happy to submit the paperwork retroactively. The rules are the rules. The rules are the rules. There's no retroactive approval process. Remove it or the fine doubles. He slapped the violation notice into my hand and strutted back to his HOA-branded SUV. That evening, as Sarah and I reviewed the HOA bylaws, a document I now realized we should have studied more carefully before purchasing, Mike Johnson leaned over our shared fence. "I see you've met the HOA enforcement squad," he said with a grimace. "Be careful with them. I'm a retired cop and even I can't stomach how they operate. Karen Matthews runs this place like it's her personal kingdom. They've forced at least 3 families to sell and move out in the past year alone." This information triggered my analytical mind, the part of me that had planned operations and assessed threats. Why would an HOA be so aggressive that it drove residents away? Homeowners associations typically wanted stability, not turnover. Something didn't add up, and in my experience, incongruities often pointed to hidden motivations. I filed a formal appeal with the HOA board, requesting a reasonable accommodation and offering to modify the trellis if necessary to meet guidelines. The response came 3 days later. Not only was my appeal denied, but we were now being cited for 5 additional violations. Mailbox color not to specification, though it was the same as when we purchased the home, lawn height exceeding the 3-inch maximum by approximately ½ an inch, improper garbage can placement, though it was behind our fence, unauthorized garden plants, Sarah's medicinal herbs, and creating a nuisance with my youth self-defense classes. The total fines now exceeded $2,000, 0 cents. This wasn't random enforcement, it was targeted harassment. As I showed Sarah the notices, I saw a familiar determination in her eyes. "This isn't right, Jack," she said quietly. "We need to stand up to them, not just for us, but for everyone else they're bullying." I nodded, feeling a calm settle over me, the same calm that preceded every mission I'd ever led. "I just wanted a quiet retirement," I said, "but it looks like we have one more operation to plan." I requested a meeting with the HOA board, determined to address this situation professionally and directly. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a tastefully decorated space that screamed over-budget renovation. 5 board members sat behind a long table like judges at a tribunal, with Karen Matthews in the center. At 58, she had perfectly coiffed blonde hair, jewelry that cost more than most residents' monthly mortgage payments, and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. To her right sat Doug Peterson, a thin man with a perpetual frown who was introduced as the treasurer and vice president. The other 3 board members remained silent throughout most of the meeting, nodding along with whatever Karen said like well-trained puppets. "Mr. Morrison," Karen began, her voice dripping with condescension, "we understand you're new to community living, but our rules exist to maintain property values and neighborhood standards. Everyone else manages to follow them." I maintained my composure, decades of high-pressure situations having trained me to keep my heart rate steady under fire. I presented printed examples of similar structures in the neighborhood that had apparently received approval, including one in Karen's own backyard. I also noted several discrepancies in the financial reports that were publicly available, vague line items for landscaping services and consulting fees that seemed unusually large for a community of our size. Doug's face reddened at this, while Karen's smile froze in place. "We're not here to discuss association finances, Mr. Morrison. We're here about your violations. Either comply or face the consequences." The dismissal was absolute, but in that moment of tension, I'd seen something valuable. A flash of panic in Doug's eyes when I mentioned the finances. In tactical training, we called this identifying the weak point. The following week, HOA patrols around our home intensified. I caught Chad taking photos through our windows, documenting God knows what violations. When confronted, he smirked and said, "Just doing my job. Maybe if you don't like being monitored, you should move somewhere without rules." His hand rested casually on his belt, near a taser, an unnecessary show of force that told me volumes about his character and training. As a SEAL, I'd learned to read people quickly, identifying threats and weaknesses. Chad was a bully who'd never faced real resistance, deriving his sense of power from intimidating those who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. His type was common in certain security roles, men who couldn't make it in legitimate law enforcement or military service, but craved authority. Sarah continued tending her herb garden despite the HOA notices, refusing to let intimidation tactics deprive her patients of the natural remedies that supplemented their treatments. One evening, returning from a particularly grueling shift where she'd lost a young car accident victim, she decided to dismantle part of the trellis. "It's not worth the battle, Jack," she said wearily. "Some fights you just have to let go." I was in the garage when I heard the commotion, raised voices, then a cry of pain. I moved without thinking, covering the distance to our front yard in seconds. Sarah was on the ground, her face contorted in pain as she clutched her shoulder. Chad and 2 other HOA employees stood over her, one holding a camera. "She refused to allow a compliance inspection," Chad said defensively as I knelt beside my wife. "We have authority to enter properties for inspection under Section 12 of the HOA agreement." Sarah looked up at me, her professional medical assessment cutting through her pain. Dislocated shoulder, possibly torn rotator cuff. My vision narrowed as decades of combat training screamed at me to neutralize the threat in front of me. 3 targets, unarmored, the primary aggressor front and center. In my SEAL days, Chad would already be unconscious, possibly with a crushed trachea. But I wasn't that man anymore, or rather, I was more than just that man. I helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her weight carefully to minimize pain to her injured shoulder. "You've made a serious mistake," I told Chad, my voice deadly quiet. Mike and his wife Rebecca had heard the commotion and arrived, Rebecca already recording with her phone. "Call the police," I told Mike. Chad scoffed. "Go ahead. Officer Benson is a personal friend. This was just a misunderstanding between neighbors." When Officer Benson arrived 20 minutes later, his cursory interview and dismissive attitude made the connection clear. He refused to file a report, suggested Sarah had tripped, and advised us to work things out like adults. As we drove to the hospital, Sarah's shoulder temporarily immobilized, I made a decision. The HOA wasn't just corrupt, it was dangerous, and dangerous organizations needed to be dismantled systematically, starting with intelligence gathering. Karen, Doug, Chad, and this Officer Benson had no idea what they'd just initiated. They saw a middle-aged couple they could bully. What they couldn't see was the methodical operator analyzing their weaknesses, mapping their connections, and preparing to dismantle their entire operation. In SEAL training, they teach you that the most dangerous enemy isn't the strongest one, it's the one who knows your vulnerabilities, I explained to Mike as we sat in his home office the next day. Sarah was resting at home, her shoulder in a sling with instructions to avoid work for at least 2 weeks. The injury was serious, but thankfully wouldn't require surgery if she followed a strict recovery protocol. Mike, a retired police detective, nodded in understanding. I've been collecting information on them for years, just never had enough leverage to do anything with it. He pulled out a thick folder containing complaints, notes from community meetings, and financial statements with highlighted inconsistencies. Karen's husband died 3 years ago under suspicious circumstances, carbon monoxide in the garage. The investigation was rushed, and Officer Benson handled it personally. She suddenly had money for luxury cars and designer clothes after being on a fixed income before. Doug Peterson was fired from First National Bank for accounting irregularities, but it was kept quiet. And Chad? He has a sealed record for domestic violence. The charges disappeared after he started working for Karen. This was the intelligence foundation I needed. Mike's wife, Rebecca, a reporter for the local paper, agreed to quietly research the HOA's financial records and Karen's sudden wealth. I've wanted to run this story for years, she confided, but could never get enough sources willing to go on record. Most people are too afraid of retaliation. I understood their fear. When you're facing an opponent with power over your home and financial security, standing up takes extraordinary courage. The same dynamic exists in countries under authoritarian control. People accept daily injustices because the cost of resistance seems too high. But every oppressive system has weaknesses, and I'd spent my career identifying and exploiting them. I called Sam Wilson, a young lawyer and former Army Ranger who owed Sarah his life after she'd worked 36 straight hours to save him following a motorcycle accident during his leave. He arrived at our home that evening, refusing payment and insisting this was about balancing the scales. Together, we pored over the HOA bylaws, state regulations governing homeowners associations, and financial disclosure requirements. They've violated at least 6 state statutes, Sam concluded, shaking his head. The problem is, enforcement usually requires residents to hire expensive attorneys and fight lengthy battles. They count on people giving up. I smiled slightly, remembering similar assessments during particularly challenging missions. They haven't faced someone with nothing but time and proper training. In the SEALs, we learned that when conventional approaches fail, you change tactics. We're going to hit them from angles they aren't defending. Over the next week, I systematically documented every HOA violation within the neighborhood. Selective enforcement was illegal under state law. I photographed Karen's unapproved gazebo, Doug's oversized shed, and the board members' homes that miraculously received no citations despite clear infractions. I filed 12 separate requests for financial records under the mandatory disclosure provision. I attended every open HOA meeting, recording each procedural violation. Sarah, even with her injury, helped by connecting me with other residents who had faced similar harassment. Our dining room became an operations center, with a large whiteboard mapping out the connections between Karen, Doug, Chad, and Officer Benson. Mike installed security cameras around our property, capturing Chad's increasingly frequent inspections and attempts to peer through our windows. "You're not going to physically confront them, are you, Jack?" Sarah asked one night, concern in her eyes as she caught me staring at the whiteboard, lost in thought. I turned to her, gently adjusting her sling to make her more comfortable. No, that would give them what they want, an excuse to escalate legally. In the teams, we learned that the most effective operations aren't about brute force. They're about leverage and timing. I kissed her forehead softly. They injured my favorite nurse. That's not something I can overlook. But I'm not going to handle this like a blunt instrument. I'm going to dismantle their entire operation so methodically they won't know what hit them until it's too late. Sarah smiled through her pain. "Just promise me you'll be careful. These people are vindictive." I nodded, understanding her concern. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already begun the first phase of the operation, and Karen Matthews' carefully constructed kingdom was about to face its first real challenge. The next HOA meeting became the opening salvo in our campaign. I arrived early, setting up a small audio recorder legally permitted in our state for public meetings and a notebook. Karen's eyes narrowed when she saw me, but she maintained her plastic smile as the room filled with residents. Most sat quietly, eyes down, clearly conditioned to avoid drawing attention. Before we begin, I said when the floor opened for resident comments, I'd like to address the board's response to my formal complaint regarding the assault on my wife by HOA enforcement personnel. A murmur ran through the crowd. Karen quickly interjected, "That's not on tonight's agenda, Mr. Morrison. We have a procedure for—" I cut her off politely but firmly. Actually, according to HOA Bylaw 7.3, residents may address safety concerns as priority items at any regular meeting. I've distributed copies of the relevant section to everyone present. I handed out pre-prepared packets containing not just the bylaw, but also witness statements regarding Sarah's injury and photos of similar unapproved structures throughout the neighborhood that hadn't received citations. Doug Peterson's face flushed red as I methodically laid out the selective enforcement pattern. "This is absurd! You're disrupting a community meeting with personal grievances," he sputtered. I maintained perfect calm, my voice steady. "I'm exercising my rights as a resident under the very bylaws you're entrusted to uphold. Additionally, I've submitted 12 requests for financial records that are legally required to be accessible to all association members. To date, none have been fulfilled, which violates both HOA transparency requirements and state law." The other residents were watching now, heads up, a few nodding slightly. Karen attempted to regain control by calling for a motion to adjourn, but I noted loudly that doing so without addressing safety concerns would constitute another bylaw violation. For perhaps the first time in years, the meeting continued despite Karen's obvious desire to end it. Over the following weeks, I created an informal online community forum for Pine Creek residents. Initially, participation was minimal, but it grew as people began sharing their own HOA horror stories anonymously. One elderly resident had been fined for having a wheelchair ramp installed without prior approval, despite ADA protections. Another family had been cited when their holiday decorations included Hanukkah symbols alongside Christmas ones, allegedly for excessive lighting. A pattern emerged of selective enforcement targeting anyone who questioned the board's decisions. I shared detailed information about residents' rights, state laws governing HOAs, and how to document violations properly. Karen tried to shut down the forum by claiming it violated HOA communication policies, but as Sam pointed out in a widely distributed legal analysis, such restrictions were unenforceable and potentially illegal. Sarah, despite her injury, returned to work on limited duty. Her nursing supervisor had rearranged schedules to accommodate her limitations, a testament to how valued she was at the hospital. During her second day back, she encountered Chad being treated for a motorcycle accident. Despite being the man who had injured her, she maintained her professional demeanor, even taking extra time to explain his care instructions clearly. "Why are you being nice to me?" he asked suspiciously. Sarah adjusted his IV with practiced hands. "Because that's my job, and because treating people with dignity isn't conditional on whether they've done the same for me." I saw a subtle change in Chad's expression when Sarah told me about the encounter. Confusion, as if a worldview was being challenged. It was a small crack, but in my experience, organizational betrayal often began with such fissures. Meanwhile, I filed a formal complaint with the state regulatory agency overseeing homeowners associations, complete with documentation of Sarah's injury, selective enforcement patterns, and financial disclosure violations. Rebecca's investigative work had uncovered concerning patterns in HOA expenditures, $15,000 for landscape consultation to a company that didn't exist but shared an address with Karen's sister, $25.00 for security consulting to Doug's son's one-man company, and over $50.00 in miscellaneous administrative expenses with no itemization. Mike's police connections provided another valuable piece of intelligence. Officer Benson received free membership to the exclusive golf club adjacent to Pine Creek courtesy of Karen, and had intervened in at least 4 previous complaints against the HOA board. The web of corruption was more extensive than we'd initially thought, not just petty power trips, but systematic financial exploitation. Karen and Doug must have received notification of the state investigation because the harassment intensified. New violation notices appeared daily. Grass too tall, improper trash can placement, unauthorized vehicles, my own truck, which had been parked in the same spot for months. Chad and another HOA employee photographed our property constantly, sometimes peering through windows. When confronted, Chad smirked. "Just doing my job. Is there a problem?" The intimidation tactics would have worked on most people, but they didn't understand who they were dealing with. In SEAL operations, increased enemy activity often signaled desperation, a recognition that their position was being compromised. Their escalation confirmed we were on the right track. The next phase of our operation would hit them where it really hurt: their finances and their carefully constructed image of authority. I returned home one afternoon to find our front door plastered with violation notices. A dozen new infractions with fines exceeding $5,000, 0 cents. Doug Peterson approached as I removed them, offering what he thought was a reasonable compromise. "Jack, this doesn't need to get messy," he said with false conciliation. "Karen asked me to talk to you man to man. We're willing to waive all the fines if you drop the state complaint and consider selling. Pine Creek might not be the right culture fit for your family." I studied him with the calm assessment I developed negotiating with warlords. "That sounds remarkably like extortion, Doug. I wonder how the state investigators would interpret such an offer." His friendly facade cracked. "You're making a big mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I allowed myself a small smile. "Actually, I think that's your problem, not mine." We escalated our strategy, with Sam obtaining a temporary restraining order preventing any surprise inspections of our property. Rebecca had collected statements from 15 residents who had experienced similar harassment, but had been afraid to speak up. Most importantly, we'd received an anonymous email from a former HOA accountant with bank statements showing a separate account under Karen and Doug's control where significant association funds had been diverted. Karen's response was to call an emergency HOA meeting to vote on a special assessment, an additional $2,000, 0 cents per household, for legal defense of community standards. The real purpose was clear: drain the association's legitimate funds before investigators could review the books. At the meeting, Karen portrayed our legal challenges as an attack on property values. After she finished, I stood and addressed the room. "My name is Jack Morrison. My wife and I moved here after I retired from 25 years of military service, looking for a peaceful community. Instead, we found an HOA being used as a personal piggy bank by its leadership. I methodically presented evidence of financial mismanagement, selective enforcement, and retaliatory practices. By meeting's end, the special assessment vote had failed, and Karen stormed out, her control visibly cracking. That night, Chad and 2 other men were caught on our security cameras attempting to access our backyard. Officer Benson dismissed the restraining order violation as a misunderstanding despite clear video evidence. Fortunately, we'd arranged for a county sheriff's deputy, a former Marine who Mike knew, to arrive minutes later. The conflicting police reports created documentation demonstrating the local police department's bias. The next morning, I filed formal complaints against both Chad and Benson, resulting in Benson being placed on administrative leave. Karen and Doug held another emergency board meeting at Karen's home, where a recording device we'd legally planted captured them discussing how to handle the Morrison problem permanently. Options included fabricating building code violations, having Benson plant evidence against us, and hiring private investigators to dig up dirt. The recording was damning, but Sam advised holding it in reserve while we pursued the financial angle. Karen, increasingly desperate, distributed a financial summary that contradicted previous reports, creating a documented paper trail of misrepresentations. Sam immediately filed updated complaints with both state authorities and the district attorney's office. The trap was set, and Karen and Doug were walking right into it. The certified letter from the HOA's attorney threatened a property lien for unpaid fines totaling $14,750, 0 cents, an absurd amount based on violations we hadn't even been notified about. Sarah's face paled as she read it. "Jack, they could actually take our home." I examined the letter carefully. "They're trying to force us to either pay or spend even more fighting it in court. It's a desperation move." Sam confirmed my assessment. "This is legally questionable at best, but fighting it would be expensive. They're betting you'll back down rather than face a protracted legal battle." I smiled slightly. They still don't understand who they're dealing with. In the SEALs, we had a saying: "The only easy day was yesterday." I've never backed down from a necessary fight. Our counterattack was multi-pronged. Sam submitted a comprehensive audit request to the court, Rebecca published her first article on the HOA's questionable practices, and we received another anonymous tip with detailed information about offshore accounts where HOA funds had been transferred. The pressure increased when Chad appeared at Sarah's hospital to deliver a thinly veiled threat. "The board wanted me to remind you that accidents happen. It would be terrible if something happened to your house while you were at work." Sarah, showing remarkable composure, responded, "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Wilson. As a mandatory reporter, I'm obligated to inform hospital security and the police. Would you like to clarify your statement before I make that call? Chad retreated quickly, clearly unprepared for her response. We hosted an informal community meeting where nearly 30 residents shared their HOA harassment stories. An elderly woman had been fined $500, 0 cents for having a religious symbol on her door. A young father was penalized because his daughter's adaptive swing set for her disability didn't meet height restrictions. By meeting's end, we had formed a homeowners' rights committee and collected enough signatures to force a special election for new HOA board members, a process Karen had avoided for years through procedural manipulation. When Karen's attorney claimed most signatures were invalid and suggested that only homeowners without outstanding violations could participate in elections, it only strengthened our resolve. Meanwhile, we learned that Officer Benson had agreed to help Karen and Doug solve their problem permanently by planting drugs in my vehicle. Surprisingly, Chad warned us of the plot. Look, I don't like you, but this has gone too far. They're planning to set you up. Benson's going to plant something in your truck tomorrow and then receive an anonymous tip about drug activity. When I asked why he was telling me this, Chad looked uncomfortable. Your wife treated me like a human being when she had every reason not to, and I've seen the financial records. Karen and Doug have been stealing from all of us for years. Instead of avoiding the trap, I decided to use it. With Sam's guidance and Mike's help, we installed additional hidden cameras in and around my truck, then waited. Around 2 a.m., our cameras captured Officer Benson planting a small package under the driver's seat. 3 hours later, he returned in uniform, citing an anonymous tip about drugs in my vehicle. The trap was set, and Benson was about to learn the consequences of underestimating a retired SEAL. When Benson approached with his anonymous tip, I played along with just enough confusion and outrage to seem authentic. I have nothing to hide, I said, providing consent to search. Benson triumphantly retrieved the package he'd planted earlier. Well, what do we have here? Looks like someone's been involved in some illegal activities. I maintained calm as he opened the package, his smirk faltering when he discovered it contained baking sugar, not illicit substances. I don't understand, he muttered. There must be some mistake. That's when I played my trump card. No mistake, Officer Benson. Just a different substance than you planted at 2:17 this morning. I've already replaced the contents, and I have high-definition video of you approaching my vehicle and placing that package. Copies have been forwarded to my attorney, the police chief, and the district attorney's office. The color drained from Benson's face. The other officer, clearly not involved in the conspiracy, looked confused. What's he talking about, Ben? Benson stood frozen, holding evidence of his own crime. In the SEALs, I said conversationally, we learn to anticipate enemy actions and prepare countermeasures. You're currently holding evidence of attempted framing of a civilian, abuse of police authority, and criminal conspiracy. The police chief arrived, Benson was taken into custody, and formal statements were collected. By afternoon, word had spread throughout Pine Creek. The corrupt officer working with the HOA had been caught red-handed. Karen and Doug panicked, calling an emergency board meeting at Karen's home, their third violation of open meeting requirements in a month. This time, we were fully prepared. Sam had obtained a court order requiring all HOA meetings to be properly noticed and open to all residents based on the pattern of prior violations. When Karen attempted to hold the meeting behind closed doors anyway, a process server delivered the court order along with a notice that continuing would constitute contempt of court. Neighbors who had previously been too intimidated to speak up gathered outside Karen's house with signs demanding financial accountability. Local news crews captured the scene. Angry residents, a flustered Karen shouting at the process server, and Doug attempting to flee through a back entrance, only to find Mike Johnson calmly waiting, recording everything on his phone. "Going somewhere, Doug?" Mike asked pleasantly. "The meeting hasn't even started yet." The recording we'd obtained from the previous closed-door meeting proved devastating when Sam played it for the district attorney. Karen and Doug explicitly discussed using HOA funds for personal expenses, targeting specific homeowners for harassment, and their plan to plant evidence with Benson's help. "This goes beyond civil violations," the assistant district attorney told Sam. "We're looking at criminal conspiracy, embezzlement, extortion, and abuse of power. We'll need formal statements from affected residents." Within 48 hours, search warrants were executed for Karen's home, Doug's residence, and the HOA office. The financial records they seized confirmed our worst suspicions. Over $250,000, 0 cents in association funds, had been diverted to personal expenses, fake consulting companies, and offshore accounts. Karen had funded luxury vacations, cosmetic procedures, and even her son's college tuition with HOA money. Doug had covered investment losses and a gambling habit. The board members who had supported them had received kickbacks in the form of waived HOA fees and personal services paid from association funds. The arrests came on a Wednesday morning. I deliberately positioned myself where I could watch as Karen was escorted from her home in handcuffs, her carefully maintained facade of superiority crumbling as neighbors witnessed her downfall. At the police station, according to Mike's source, Karen demanded to know why she was being treated like a common criminal. The booking officer replied with a hint of satisfaction. "Do you know who you've been harassing, Mrs. Matthews? That man you've been threatening is a decorated Navy SEAL with 25 years of service. You're lucky all he did was expose your crimes instead of using his particular set of skills." Karen's face reportedly went pale as the realization sank in. Morrison is a SEAL? The officer nodded. Team 6, Bronze Star with Valor. And you pushed his wife down a flight of stairs. Rebecca's front page story ran the next day. Hundreds of thousands stolen, residents systematically harassed. She detailed the financial crimes, the pattern of selective enforcement, and the attempt to frame me with planted evidence. Other news outlets picked up the story, focusing on the dramatic elements: a retired SEAL systematically dismantling corruption in his community, officials abusing power against the very veterans who had served the country. The coverage sparked similar investigations in other communities, with state regulators promising increased oversight of homeowners associations statewide. At the emergency community meeting held in the Pine Creek Clubhouse, over 100 residents attended, more than had participated in HOA activities in years. I presented a complete accounting of what we'd discovered, including the financial losses that had resulted in deferred maintenance and unnecessary fee increases. Many residents were seeing for the first time how they had been manipulated and exploited by people they had trusted to look after community interests. They counted on our apathy and fear, I explained. They knew most people would rather pay unfair fines than fight a system that seemed too powerful to challenge. They used that psychology to create a climate where they could operate without accountability. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, not for me specifically, but for the restoration of fairness and transparency. The interim HOA board elected that night immediately established new policies requiring financial transparency, fair enforcement procedures, and proper notification of all meetings and decisions. They reduced association fees by 30% while actually increasing services, simply by eliminating the systematic theft that had drained resources for years. Thomas Murray, a city council member who had previously supported Karen, publicly apologized for his failure to investigate residents' complaints. "This situation has taught me a valuable lesson about listening to constituents and questioning those in positions of authority," he said during a council meeting. "I'm proposing new city regulations to ensure proper oversight of all homeowners associations within our jurisdiction." Chad Wilson faced lesser charges after cooperating with prosecutors. At his sentencing hearing, he made a statement that surprised everyone. "I want to apologize particularly to Sarah Morrison. When you treated me with dignity in the hospital despite what I'd done, it forced me to question everything. I got involved with the HOA because it gave me a sense of power I was missing elsewhere in my life. I've learned that real strength isn't about controlling others, it's about holding yourself accountable." The judge sentenced him to probation and community service at the local Veterans Center, where Chad would later say he learned more about real courage and integrity in 1 month than in his entire previous life. Karen and Doug received no such leniency. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and neither showed genuine remorse. Karen maintained that she had simply been managing the community according to standards, while Doug claimed he was just following established financial practices. The judge was unimpressed, sentencing Karen to 4 years in state prison for embezzlement, conspiracy, and misuse of property funds. Doug received 3 years. Their assets were seized to repay the stolen HOA funds, with Karen's luxury car and vacation timeshares sold at auction to help restore the depleted community accounts. Officer Benson lost his badge, his pension, and eventually his freedom. receiving 2 years for abuse of power, conspiracy, and planting false evidence. His case sent shockwaves through the local police department, prompting an internal affairs investigation that uncovered other instances of favoritism and misconduct. The police chief, fighting to restore his department's reputation, implemented new training and accountability measures, personally apologizing to Sarah and me for the department's failure to properly investigate the assault. 6 months after the arrests, Pine Creek Estates had transformed. The community that had once operated under a cloud of fear now held regular social events, neighborhood improvement projects, and transparent governance meetings. The trellis I had built for Sarah stood as a symbol of our victory, covered in flowering vines that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. My self-defense classes for neighborhood youth had grown to include seminars on civic engagement and community organization for adults, teaching the same principles that had helped us overcome systematic corruption. One evening, as Sarah and I sat on our front porch watching the sunset, Mike and Rebecca joined us with a bottle of wine to celebrate the 6-month anniversary of the revolution, as residents had taken to calling it. "Did you ever imagine when you moved here that you'd end up leading a community uprising?" Rebecca asked, raising her glass in a toast. I smiled, watching children playing freely in front yards that had once been subject to arbitrary and capricious restrictions. In the SEALs, we had a saying, "The only easy day was yesterday." But we also learned that the right team, the right strategy, and unwavering determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. This community had everything it needed to free itself. It just needed someone to show them how to fight smart instead of surrendering to intimidation. Sarah leaned against my shoulder, her injury long healed but the experience permanently etched in our memories. The irony is that Karen and her crew thought they were building their personal kingdom, but they actually created the conditions for a truly united community. Sometimes people need a common enemy to discover their common humanity. Mike nodded in agreement. "I've lived here 15 years and never knew half my neighbors until this happened. Now we're planning block parties and community gardens. Karen would hate what she accidentally created." We all laughed at that, the sound carrying across front yards where neighbors waved and smiled, genuine connections replacing the artificial standards that had kept everyone isolated and afraid. The last remnants of the old regime disappeared when the new board removed the ostentatious Pine Creek Estates, a premier community sign that Karen had commissioned with embezzled funds, and replaced it with a simple marker reading, "Pine Creek, where neighbors become friends." The former HOA enforcement office was converted into a community center offering resources for residents, including a small library, meeting spaces, and weekly farmers market. Chad, having completed his community service, surprised everyone by volunteering at the center, his first-hand knowledge of the previous system's abuses making him particularly effective at helping residents understand their rights and responsibilities. Sarah returned to her nursing career fully, but with a new focus on community health education. The experience with the HOA had shown her how systems designed to protect people could be weaponized against them when transparency and accountability were removed. She developed programs teaching patients to advocate for themselves in healthcare settings, applying the same principles that had helped us overcome institutional bullying. Her shoulder occasionally ached in cold weather, a physical reminder of where our journey had begun, but she considered it a small price to pay for the community we have now. As for me, the skills I had honed over 25 years as a SEAL found unexpected application in civilian life. The methodical intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and tactical patience that had served me in combat zones proved equally valuable in confronting domestic corruption. I began consulting with other communities facing similar issues, teaching residents how to document abuses, build coalitions, and use legal leverage to restore fairness and transparency. The principles are the same whether you're facing armed insurgents or corrupt bureaucrats, I explained during a community organizing workshop. Identify the power structure, document the abuses, build alliances, and apply pressure at the weakest points. Most importantly, never let them isolate you. Isolation is how corrupt systems maintain control. 1 year after Karen's arrest, Pine Creek Estates hosted its first community-wide celebration, not the exclusive appearance-focused gatherings of the previous regime, but an inclusive block party where children played freely, neighbors shared home-cooked food, and differences were celebrated rather than regulated into conformity. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across lawns now personalized to reflect the diverse tastes and needs of individual families, a reporter from a national magazine covering the event asked me what I considered the most important lesson from our experience. "Freedom requires maintenance," I said after considering the question. Whether it's a nation or a neighborhood, the price of liberty is constant vigilance against those who would use power for personal gain rather than community benefit. In the military, I fought for American values on foreign soil. Here, I discovered those same values needed defending in my own backyard. The weapons were different, documents instead of rifles, evidence instead of explosives, but the fundamental principle was identical. Stand up for what's right, no matter the personal cost. The reporter nodded thoughtfully. And was it worth it? All the stress, the risk to your reputation, the threat to your home? I looked across the gathering where Sarah was laughing with neighbors who had once been too frightened to speak to each other, then at the trellis that had started our journey, now a living monument to persistence and renewal. Some fights choose you. When they do, the only question is whether you'll face them with courage or bow to intimidation. For 25 years in the SEALs, I learned that the hardest battles often yield the most meaningful victories. This wasn't the peaceful retirement I imagined, but it gave us something more valuable, a community worth fighting for.